They called him the Ghost of Fallujah, the most decorated Marine raider in Iraq's bloodiest battles. But to the people of Pine Valley, Montana, Marcus "Mac" Sullivan was just the quiet veteran who ran the struggling horse sanctuary in Thunder Creek Valley. For months, the Raven Riders had been terrorizing the peaceful mountain community, thinking they owned these winding mountain roads, until they made the biggest mistake of their lives. When the Outlaws torched Mac's rehabilitation barn, the same barn where he'd helped countless wounded veterans find peace through working with rescued horses, they thought they were just intimidating another helpless rancher. What the ruthless gang leader didn't know was that this weathered 68-year-old was about to make one phone call that would summon an army of over 250 elite warriors who'd fought beside him in the world's deadliest combat zones. The Montana morning painted frost across Thunder Creek Valley's vast meadows as Mac Sullivan moved with practiced precision through his dawn routine. His weathered hands, steady as they'd been in combat, methodically checked each horse stall, ensuring his four-legged charges were comfortable despite the bitter autumn chill. Through the barn's wide doors, the distant peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains stood sentinel, their snow-capped summits catching the day's first light. Sarah Chen watched from her veterinary clinic across the gravel road, absently organizing supplies, while keeping an eye on her friend and most frequent client. "Coffee's getting cold, Mac," she called out, her voice carrying a warmth that barely masked her growing concern about recent changes in their valley. "These mountains have seen enough trouble lately." Mac secured the last stall gate with military precision before turning toward the clinic. "Some things can't be rushed, Sarah. Some things need to be done right." His voice was gentle, but carried an undertone of steel that few in town had ever noticed. Inside the clinic, Deputy Tom Harrison nursed his cooling coffee, his badge catching the morning light as his eyes tracked three black motorcycles rumbling past Mac's sanctuary. The machine's engines were deliberately loud, their riders leather, cuts bearing the distinctive raven emblem that had become synonymous with fear in these parts. "Fourth time this week," Tom muttered as Mac entered the clinic. "They're getting bolder." Mac settled onto his usual stool, his movements carrying the same precision he'd shown with the horses. Sarah placed a fresh cup of coffee before him, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced toward the window. "They were here yesterday afternoon, Mac. 6 of them. Scared my patients half to death." The bell above the clinic door chimed as Ellen Martinez entered, her Forest Service uniform crisp despite the early hour. She nodded to each person in turn before settling next to Mac. "Morning, folks. Suppose you've heard about the Watson place." Mac wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill settling in his gut. "Kyle mentioned something yesterday. Vandalism? That's putting it mildly," Tom sighed, accepting a coffee refill from Sarah. "Burned their winter hay storage to the ground. Left one of their calling cards, a raven carved into what was left of the door. Third incident this month." "First it was Miller's feed store," Sarah added quietly. "Then the Rocky Mountain Outfitters. Now this." Tom's jaw tightened. "They're smart. Never enough evidence to make charges stick, and folks are too scared to testify anyway." Max studied his reflection in the coffee's dark surface. "Fear's a funny thing, Tom. Makes people forget who they are, what they're capable of." "Speaking from experience?" Ellen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Mac's eyes took on a distant look, seeing something far beyond the clinic's walls. Back in '03, had a young corporal in my unit, green as spring grass, scared of his own shadow. Outside Fallujah, worst firefight I'd seen since the push began. That corporal, he found something inside himself that day, something stronger than fear. What happened to him? Sarah asked softly. A slight smile crossed Mac's face. Last I heard, he was running a successful security consulting firm in Colorado. Fear didn't define him. His response to it did. The rumble of engines grew louder outside. Through the window, they watched as 3 motorcycles parked directly in front of Mac's barn. Jack the Raven. Reynolds stepped off his bike, his expensive leather jacket at odds with the rugged setting. He deliberately kicked over Mac's handmade sign advertising equine therapy for veterans. "Better clean that up, old-timer," he called out, his voice carrying through the clinic windows. "Wouldn't want any of your broken soldiers tripping over it." Mac continued sipping his coffee, seemingly unperturbed by the display of intimidation, but Ellen noticed how his knuckles had whitened around the cup. "They're pushing," Tom said quietly, "testing boundaries, seeing who'll break first." "That how you see it, Deputy?" Mac's voice remained steady. Tom met his gaze. "How do you see it, Mac?" "I see men who mistake cruelty for strength, who think if fear equals respect." Mac stood slowly, leaving money for his coffee. "Learned a long time ago, men like that don't stop pushing until they hit something solid." As Mac walked toward the door, Sarah called after him. "Mac, what are you going to do?" He paused, his hand on the door handle. "Same thing I do every morning, Sarah. Tend my horses, help my veterans, remember who I am." He looked back at them, and for just a moment they saw something in his eyes. Not anger, but the kind of quiet resolve that moved mountains. "Question is, when the time comes, will this valley remember who it is?" The door closed behind him with a gentle chime. They watched through the window as Mac crossed the gravel road, walking past the sneering outlaws without acknowledgement. He began picking up his fallen sign, his movements unhurried but purposeful. "Sometimes I forget," Sarah said softly, "what he used to be, before he was just Mac with his horses." Ellen's face was grim. "Way things are going, we might all be reminded soon enough." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Thunder Creek Valley, its light catching the bronze Marine Corps emblem that hung proudly above Mac's barn door. The emblem moved gently in the mountain breeze, its shadow falling across the gravel like a line drawn in the sand, a boundary that once crossed would change everything. Jack Reynolds sat astride his custom Harley, watching Mac's barn through. Designer sunglasses as the morning sun glinted off his chrome handlebars and the raven-shaped ring on his right hand. Behind him, 4 raven riders waited on their bikes, engines idling with predatory patience. The old Marine was still inside, visible through the barn window as he worked with a young veteran, teaching him how to approach a nervous rescue horse. "He's either stupid or brave," Dylan Marcus muttered from the back of his bike, rolling an unlit cigarette between his fingers. "Everyone else in the valley's falling in line, but he acts like we don't even exist." Reynolds' leather jacket creaked as he shifted. "Don't much care which. Time we had a chat with our friendly neighborhood horse whisperer." Inside the veterinary clinic, Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the phone. Tom stopped her with a gentle touch. "Don't," the deputy whispered. "Mac knows what he's doing." The Raven Riders spread out as Reynolds approached Mac's barn, their movements carrying the casual menace of circling wolves. Through the window, they could see Mac, calmly, finishing his session with the young veteran, his movements steady and sure as he demonstrated proper grooming technique. "Nice morning for horse therapy, old-timer," Reynolds called out, his voice carrying mock politeness. Mac emerged from the barn, leading the young veteran to his truck, his movements unhurried. "Every morning's nice when you're doing what matters," he replied, his eyes focused on ensuring his client safely departed rather than on the men surrounding him. Reynolds stepped closer, using his height to loom over Mac. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. See, some folks in the valley, they've learned their lesson. They understand how things work now. But you," he reached out, touching the Marine Raider pin on Mac's worn denim jacket, "you seem confused about the natural order of things." Mac's eyes moved from Reynolds' hand to his face, and something in his gaze made the outlaw leader take an unconscious step backward. "Natural order's a funny thing, son. Nature's got a way of surprising folks who think they understand it." Dylan moved forward, his hand instinctively reaching inside his cut, but Reynolds held up a staying hand. His smile was cold as mountain frost. "Strong words for someone your age, living on borrowed time." "Time's a gift," Mac replied, beginning to walk past them toward his barn. "What matters is how you use it." Reynolds' hand shot out, gripping Mac's arm. "Nobody walks away from me, old man." What happened next occurred so quickly that Dylan would later have trouble describing it. One moment, Reynolds held Mac's arm. The next, he was stumbling backward, his wrist twisted at an awkward angle. Mac stood exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged as if nothing had happened. "Son," he said quietly, "there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who know when they're outmatched, and those who have to learn the hard way." Question is, which kind are you? Dylan watched in stunned silence as Mac walked away, his pace unhurried. Reynolds rubbed his wrist, rage building in his eyes. "Boss," Dylan started. "Shut up," Reynolds' voice cracked like a whip. "Tonight we show this valley what happens to people who don't show proper respect. Starting with that precious barn he loves so much." Inside the barn, Mac began his afternoon chores, his movements as precise as ever. But those who knew him well might have noticed how he positioned himself to keep the entrance in view, how he chose tasks that offered clear sightlines to all approaches. Ellen Martinez entered, concern evident on her face. Words spreading about what happened. "Reynolds isn't the type to let this go." "No," Mac agreed, checking the water levels in the horse troughs. "Men like that never are. Pride won't let them. I could post rangers at the sanctuary entrance." "No," Mac's voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes the best defense isn't the most obvious one." Ellen studied the older man, seeing something shift beneath his calm exterior. "You're planning something." "Planning?" Mac's smile carried decades of secrets. "Just remembering. There was a night in '04 outside Ramadi. Our unit was surrounded, outgunned. Everyone said we were finished." He straightened a bridle with military precision. "Sometimes victory isn't about who has the most weapons. It's about who has the strongest network." As afternoon faded into evening, Dylan sat in his bike across from Mac's barn, watching the old Marine lock up for the day. His hand kept returning to the cross his grandmother had given him, fingers worrying the metal as he remembered her words about choosing the right path. Through his earpiece, he could hear Reynolds coordinating tonight's action. They would send a message, make an example. But as Dylan watched Mac walk home, straight-backed and dignified despite the weight of threats around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The sun began to set over Thunder Creek Valley, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The Marine Corps emblem above Mac's barn caught the last rays of light, still hanging proudly despite the shadow of violence gathering around it. In the clinic, Sarah watched Mac's house through worried eyes, her hands clutching a phone she knew she wouldn't use. "Lord," she whispered, "what are you planning, Mac?" Across town, in a secluded workshop, Mac opened an old footlocker he hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath carefully preserved photographs of young Marines in desert combat gear, lay a satellite phone and a worn notebook. His fingers traced a familiar number, one he'd memorized decades ago, but never thought he'd need to use again. "Some debts," he murmured to the empty room, "never expire." Darkness settled over Thunder Creek Valley like a heavy blanket, broken only by scattered porch lights and the warm glow from Sarah's veterinary clinic. Mac sat in his study, an old photograph spread before him under the desk lamp's gentle light. In it, a younger version of himself stood beside a group of Marine raiders, their faces weathered by the Iraqi sun. The Marine Corps emblem that now hung above his barn was clearly visible in the photo, mounted on their combat vehicle's hood. His fingers traced the faces in the photograph. "Just like old times," he murmured, waiting for the enemy to make their move. Through his window, he could see 6 motorcycles gathering at the far end of the gravel road. Jack Reynolds stood beneath a lone streetlight, smoke from his cigarette curling around him like a raven's wing. More bikes were arriving, their headlights off, engines nearly silent. Inside the veterinary clinic, Sarah turned the sign to closed, her hands shaking slightly. Tom Harrison stood beside her, watching the gathering outlaws through the blinds. "Shouldn't we do something?" Sarah whispered. Tom's hand rested on his service weapon. Mac said to wait, said timing was everything. The night air carried the sound of boots on gravel as Reynolds' men moved into position. Dylan Marcus hung back, his grandmother's cross clicking softly between his fingers. Something about the old Marine's calm throughout the day had set him on edge. "Remember," Reynolds addressed his men, his voice carrying in the still night air, "we're teaching a lesson about respect, about consequences." He held up a gas can, moonlight glinting off his raven ring. Mac watched them approach his barn, his expression unchanged. He opened his desk drawer, removing the satellite phone and the worn notebook. A familiar number was written on the first page, the ink faded but still legible. The memory hit him with sudden clarity. Fallujah, 2004. His team pinned down by insurgent forces, a wounded platoon waiting for extraction. Everyone said it was suicide to attempt the rescue, but he'd made a call then too, and help had come. Reynolds' voice cut through his memories. "Bring him out. Let him watch this." Mac rose slowly, moving to his front door with measured steps. Outside, Raven riders had formed a loose semicircle around his barn. Reynolds stood at its center, gas can in hand. "Last chance, old-timer," he called out. "Kneel and apologize for disrespecting me this morning, and maybe we just burn the hay instead of the whole barn." Mac emerged onto his porch, his posture straight, hands clasped calmly before him. The sight of his composure in the face of such threat made several outlaws shift uneasily. "Son," his voice carried clearly despite its softness, "you're about to make the kind of mistake that changes lives." Reynolds laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Look around, old man. You're alone. No one's coming to help you." "That's where you're wrong, boy." Something shifted in Mac's stance, a subtle, transformation that Dylan noticed even if he couldn't name it. The quiet horse trainer seemed to fade, replaced by something harder, something forged in combat. See, there's something you need to understand about old Marines. As if on cue, a distant rumble began to build, not the growl of motorcycles, but something deeper, more organized. Reynolds' head snapped toward the sound, the gas can freezing halfway to the barn wall. "We never fight alone," Mac continued, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "And we never forget our debts." The rumble grew louder, and now emergency lights began flashing at the end of the valley road. But they weren't just local. Responders. Military stickers marked many of the approaching vehicles. "What the hell is this?" one of Reynolds' men demanded, backing toward his bike. "This," Mac's smile hadn't wavered, "is just the advance guard. The real force is still 6 hours out." More vehicles were arriving by the minute, their occupants moving with military precision. These weren't weekend warriors or local militia. These were combat veterans who moved like they'd never left the service. Dylan watched in growing awe as the Outlaws' advantage evaporated. Where moments ago they had surrounded one old rancher, now they found themselves facing an organized force that moved with practiced coordination. Reynolds' facade of control cracked slightly. "You're bluffing! No way you could—" "One phone call," Mac cut him off. "That's all it took. One call to remind my brothers that the barn you're about to burn, it's not just my barn, it belongs to all of us. To every veteran who found healing here, who remembered who they were while working with these horses." Inside the veterinary clinic, now serving as an unofficial briefing area, Sarah served coffee to a mix of townspeople and newly arrived veterans. The atmosphere had shifted from fear to cautious hope as stories were shared. "I was there," an older veteran told the gathered crowd. "Outside Fallujah, 2004. Trapped behind enemy lines with no way out. Everyone said we were done for. Then this team appears out of nowhere, moving through the heaviest fire I'd ever seen. Mac pulled 15 of us out that day. Never asked for anything in return, just said, 'This is what brothers do.'" A young veteran rushed into the clinic, face flushed with excitement. "You got to see this. The highways are full of them. Must be 60 more vehicles heading this way." Outside, Mac stood with Torres, studying the valley map. "They'll try something before the main force arrives," he said quietly. Reynolds' pride won't let him wait. "Let them try," Torres replied grimly. "We've got 40 years of combat experience surrounding that compound. These outlaw boys want to play soldier. Let's show them what real warriors look like." A veteran approached at a run. "Sir, movement at the compound. Looks like they're splitting up, small groups heading out different directions." Mac's eyes narrowed. "They're probing our defenses, testing our response time." He turned to Torres. "Remember Baghdad 2005? Same principle." Torres grinned. "Like riding a bike, sir. Never forget." He began issuing orders, veterans moving with practiced efficiency to counter the outlaws' movements. At the compound, Reynolds watched his scouts depart, trying to regain control of a situation spiraling beyond his understanding. "Find their weak points," he ordered. "These old-timers can't cover everything." "Boss," Dylan shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should consider, call in help from other chapters?" "We are the help," Reynolds exploded. "We're the ones people fear. I won't let some geriatric war relics take that away." But his words lacked their usual conviction. Through the window, he could see more veteran vehicles arriving, their formation perfect, their purpose clear. These weren't weekend warriors playing at being tough. These were men and women who'd faced real combat, real death, and had emerged stronger. In his home office, Mac looked at the old photograph again. The faces of his unit stared back, young men and women who'd learned the true meaning of brotherhood in the crucible of war. The satellite phone rang. Martinez checking in. "How's it looking, Mac?" "Like old times, Ellen. They're testing us, looking for weakness, just like the insurgents at Haifa Street. Remember what you told me that night about the difference between outlaws and warriors?" Martinez's smile carried through the line. "Outlaws fight because they can. Warriors fight because they understand why they have to. We're 4 hours out, 300 strong. Can you hold?" Mac watched through his window as veterans moved with practiced precision, securing positions, establishing communications, transforming Thunder Creek Valley into a fortress. "Oh, we'll hold. These boys are about to learn the difference between intimidation and real strength." Thunder Creek Valley held its breath as midnight approached. The Outlaws' first probe came from the east. 4 motorcycles running dark, trying to slip through the veterans' perimeter. They made it 3 blocks before finding their path blocked by parked trucks arranged with military precision. As they turned to find another route, more vehicles moved silently into position behind them. "Like fish in a barrel," Torres muttered into his radio, watching from his elevated position. "Just like you said, sir. They're thinking like thugs, not soldiers." The trapped Raven Riders gathered in a tight circle, their hushed arguments carrying clearly in the night air. "Hey, this was a mistake," one hissed to their leader. "These aren't normal folk. They're playing chess while we're playing checkers." Before his companion could respond, bright lights suddenly flooded the street from all directions. The Outlaws found themselves illuminated from every angle, while their observers remained hidden in darkness. "Gentlemen," Torres's voice cut through, the night carrying the unmistakable tone of military command, "I suggest you consider your next move very carefully." At the Raven Riders' compound, Reynolds paced nervously as he waited for reports. The radio crackled with his trapped men's voices, the fear evident even through the static. "They've got us surrounded, boss. These veterans, they're moving like a real military unit." Dillon watched Reynolds' face darken. "We should pull everyone back," he suggested quietly. "Regroup while we can." "Shut up!" Reynolds hurled a chair across the room. "I won't let some old-timers make us look weak." "Too late for that," Chase muttered, earning a murderous glare from his boss. Across town at Mac's Sanctuary, now serving as the command center, the old Marine coordinated the veterans' movements with the same quiet efficiency he'd used in Fallujah. The barn office had transformed into a tactical operations center with maps and communication equipment covering every surface. "Echo team reports movement from the south," a veteran radio operator announced. "Larger group this time. Maybe 10. Yikes." Mac studied the map, his mind calculating angles and options. "They're getting desperate, trying to overwhelm one section of our perimeter." He keyed his radio. "All units be advised. Main thrust coming from the south, but watch your flanks. This is probably a diversion." Sarah entered, carrying fresh coffee, her eyes widening at the sophistication of the operation. "Mac, half the town's gathered at my clinic. They want to know what's happening." "Tell them to stay inside," Mac replied without looking up from his map. "This is about to get complicated." As if confirming his words, the sound of engines roared. From the south, but these weren't the stealthy approaches of before. This was a full-on charge, the Raven Riders apparently abandoning subtlety for brute force. Here they come. Torres's voice crackled over the radio. 10 bikes moving fast, no tactical formation, just raw speed. Just like we planned, Mac's voice remained steady. Let them through the first line. The charging motorcycles roared past. The first veteran positions, their whoops of triumph dying in their throats as they realized they were being channeled, not evading. Steel cables suddenly pulled taut across side streets, forcing them down a predetermined path. Now, Mac commanded. Veterans emerged from doorways and alleys, moving with coordinated precision. Police cars appeared at intersections, lights flashing. Within moments, the Outlaws' charge had been contained in a 3-block area, completely surrounded. "What the hell is this?" one of the trapped Raven Riders demanded. This, Mac's voice carried clearly as he stepped into view, is what real, tactical planning looks like. The old veteran stood calmly in the street, surrounded by men and women who moved with the deadly grace of trained warriors. The contrast between their disciplined presence and the Outlaws' chaotic charge couldn't have been clearer. "Last chance," Mac announced. "Surrender your bikes, walk away. No charges filed, no consequences. Continue this fight and you'll learn why they called us the Ghosts of Fallujah." One of the younger Raven Riders, barely 20, suddenly gunned his engine and charged directly at Mac. Before anyone could react, 3 veterans moved in perfect coordination. The bike's front tire was shot out, its rider expertly detained, the entire incident over in seconds. "That's one choice," Mac commented mildly. "Anyone else want to try their luck against men and women who've spent decades perfecting the art of combat?" Back at the compound, Reynolds listened to his men's radio calls with growing desperation. "Fall back!" he screamed into the radio. "Everyone, fall back!" But it was too late. The veterans had predicted this too, cutting off escape routes with the same military precision that had trapped them. One by one, Raven Riders found themselves facing a choice: surrender or escalate against opponents who clearly outmatched them. "Boss!" Chase's voice shook slightly. "We've lost contact with the South team. Echo team surrounded. This isn't working." Dylan watched Reynolds' world crumbling. He'd built his power on fear and intimidation, but these veterans seemed immune to both, systematically dismantling the gang's reputation with each perfectly executed maneuver. In the veterinary clinic, townspeople watched through windows as the veterans efficiently contained the Raven Riders' attempted show of force. Ellen Martinez stood with Sarah and others, amazement on their faces. "My God," Sarah whispered, "look at them. They move like they've been doing this together for years." "They have," Ellen replied, watching with professional appreciation. "Just not here, not recently, but some skills you never forget." Mac's voice now came over the radio again, addressing the surrounded Raven Riders. "Colonel Martinez's main force is 3 hours out. When they arrive, this ends one way or another. Choice is yours how it ends." The trapped outlaws looked at each other, their usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. They were used to being the predators, not the prey. Now they found themselves caught in a trap laid by men and women who'd learned their trade in the harshest school imaginable. Dylan Rodriguez watched from his hidden position as more Raven Riders surrendered, the clatter of kickstands hitting, pavement spreading like falling dominoes. As he observed Mac directing the operation, he finally understood what they'd missed about him. This wasn't just an old man who'd served in a war. This was a legend who'd never stopped being a warrior. The night's first engagement was ending, but Dylan knew it was just the beginning. Reynolds' pride would demand retaliation, But for the first time, Dylan wondered if he was on the wrong side of history. The quiet horse trainer had just shown them what real power looked like. Not the power of fear, but the power of disciplined strength and unbreakable bonds. Dawn's first light crept over Thunder Creek Valley as veterans processed the captured Raven Riders. Torres supervised the operation with military efficiency, cataloging seized bikes and weapons, while Tom Harrison handled the legal documentation. The night's engagement had yielded more than just prisoners. It had shattered the Outlaws' aura of invincibility. 28 detained, 12 bikes impounded, Torres reported to Mac at the command center. Most of them are young, scared, never faced real opposition before. Mac stood at the operations map, marking updated positions with the same precision. He'd used plotting missions in Iraq. And the others? 5 escaped back to the compound, including Reynolds' Lieutenant Chase. They're holed up in their clubhouse. Inside the veterinary clinic, now serving as a support hub, Sarah and other townspeople provided coffee and food to the veterans while sharing information about outlaw movements. The fear that had paralyzed the valley for months was being replaced by something else: hope. "Never seen anything like it," Kyle Watson told the gathered crowd, his winter hay storage still smoldering from the Outlaws' earlier attack. Way they moved, way they worked together, like watching a dance they'd practiced their whole lives. A veteran at the counter smiled. "That's because we have. Some things you never forget." At the Raven Riders' compound, Reynolds' rage filled the command room like poison gas. Maps and papers littered the floor, casualties of his latest outburst. "How?" he demanded of no one in particular. "How did they predict every move?" Dylan stood in the corner, his decision crystallizing with each passing moment. "Because they've done this before," he said quietly. "Not against outlaw gangs, against armies. What we did last night, those same tactics. They learned to counter them against enemies with air support and heavy weapons." "What did you say?" Reynolds' voice dropped dangerously. "Been doing more. Research on Sullivan, found mission reports from Iraq. The tactics they used last night, same ones he used evacuating surrounded units under heavy fire. He's not just fighting us, he's teaching them, training them to his standards." Chase nursed his wounded pride and a cup of coffee. "They're not just old veterans. They're his veterans. Men and women who owe him their lives. You can't break that. A kind of loyalty with fear." Reynolds' hand slammed onto his desk. "Then we break it with blood. Call our contacts in Nevada. I want professional mercenaries, heavy weapons. We'll show them what real war looks like." But Dylan had stopped listening. Through the window, he watched more veteran vehicles arriving, their movements coordinated and purposeful. His hand found his grandmother's cross again, and he knew what he had to do. At the command center, Mac received an update from his forward observers. "Riders are making calls," a young veteran reported. "Lots of them to Nevada primarily. They're calling in professionals." Mac nodded. "Good. Makes our job easier." Torres raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure?" "Professionals know when they're outmatched. They calculate odds, not ego. Unlike Reynolds, they'll understand what they're really facing." Tom Harrison entered with fresh intelligence. "Just intercepted some calls. They're bringing in heavy weapons, military-grade stuff. This is escalating, Mac." "It was always going to," Mac replied calmly. "Men like Reynolds don't know how to lose gracefully, but that's exactly what we're counting on." Outside, Dylan approached the veteran perimeter with his hands raised. 2 veterans materialized from cover, moving with the smooth efficiency of Long-time operators. I want to speak to Sullivan, he said firmly. I have information he needs to hear. In the clinic, Sarah watched through the window as Dylan was escorted to the command center. That's Reynolds's intelligence officer, she told Ellen. What's he doing here? Choosing a side, Ellen replied softly. Finally, Mac met Dylan in what had once been his barn office. Maps and communication equipment had transformed it into a military command post, but his calm presence remained unchanged. Sit. He gestured to a chair. Tell me why you're here. Dylan's words came in a rush. Reynolds has lost it. He's calling in Silver State mercenaries, heavy weapons, professional killers. But that's not the worst part. He's planning to target civilians, create chaos to split your forces. Mac's expression didn't change. Why are you telling me this? Dylan hesitated, then pulled out his grandmother's cross. My abuela always said there are two kinds of strength, the kind that breaks things and the kind that builds them. I've been serving the wrong kind. A slight smile crossed Mac's face. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Like you, she never needed fear to earn respect. The satellite phone chirped, and Mac answered it with practiced efficiency. Go ahead. 2 hours out, Martinez's voice crackled through. Getting reports from towns we've passed. People lining the streets watching us pass. Word spreading about what's happening in Thunder Creek Valley. Good, Mac replied. Let them see. Let them understand. He turned back to Dylan. You understand what switching sides means? There's no going back. I understand, Dylan nodded. I've seen enough to know which side I want to be on when this ends. Outside, veterans continued fortifying positions as the morning sun climbed higher. Torres coordinated with newly arrived units, integrating them into the defense with practiced ease. The contrast between their disciplined preparation and the Outlaws' chaos couldn't have been clearer. At the compound, Reynolds received confirmation that his reinforcements were en route. Professional killers, heavy weapons, everything he'd requested. But as he watched more veteran vehicles arrive through his binoculars, a cold feeling settled in his stomach. These weren't just old soldiers playing at war. They were warriors who'd never stopped being ready for battle. Boss, Chase approached cautiously. Dylan's gone. Switched sides. Reynolds's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. Doesn't matter. When our people arrive, we'll show everyone what real power looks like. We'll burn this whole valley if we have to. But even as he spoke, Ellen Martinez's force drew closer, 300 strong, moving with the precision of a military convoy. In his command center, Mac prepared for the next phase of an operation he'd been planning since the moment Reynolds first threatened his sanctuary. The stage was set for a confrontation that would prove once and for all the difference between those who ruled through fear and those who led through respect. Between those who broke things and those who built them. Between those who fought for money and those who fought for something far more precious. Honor, duty, and the unbreakable bonds of true warriors. Through the mountain passes leading to Thunder Creek Valley, a steady stream of vehicles continued to arrive. Each carried veterans who'd dropped everything at a moment's notice, responding to a call from a man who'd once led them through hell itself. Their headlights cut through the morning mist like arrows, pointing the way to a battle that would be fought not with the weapons of war, but with the strength of unbreakable bonds forged in combat's crucible. Martinez's voice crackled over the command center radio. Advanced teams reporting mercenary vehicles spotted on the interstate. 12 SUVs heavily armed. They're professionals, Mac. Ex-military contractors. Good, Mac replied, studying the valley map. Means they'll understand exactly what they're walking into. Sometimes the best battle is the one you prevent by showing overwhelming force. Torres coordinated the veterans' defensive positions, each team knowing exactly where they needed to be. Years of combat experience had taught them that victory often came not from superior firepower, but from superior positioning and unshakable unit cohesion. Dylan worked alongside them now, his intimate knowledge of the Raven Riders' operations proving invaluable. They'll try to split your forces, he explained, pointing to key locations on the map. Reynolds thinks if he can create enough chaos, your coordination will break down. Mac's smile carried decades of tactical wisdom. He still doesn't understand. Chaos was our classroom. We learned our trade in places where coordination meant survival. The morning sun now bathed Thunder Creek Valley in golden light, revealing the full extent of the veterans' preparations. What had started as a desperate defense of one man's sanctuary had transformed into a masterclass in military precision and brotherhood. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Thunder Creek Valley as 3 black SUVs appeared on the horizon. They drove low and fast along the mountain roads, carrying Reynolds' mercenary reinforcements and enough firepower to level a small town. Mac watched their approach from his command post, his expression unchanged. "Just like Ramadi," he murmured. "They think overwhelming force is the answer." Dylan stood beside him, providing details about what was coming. 15 professional contractors, former special operations, heavy weapons including mounted machine guns and military-grade explosives. Good intel. Torres nodded, but a slight smile crossed his face. "But you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "They're fighting for money," Mac replied calmly. "We're fighting for something else." The SUVs entered the valley, disgorging their cargo of men and weapons at the Raven Riders' compound. Their commander, Marcus Kane, carried himself with professional, military bearing, a stark contrast to Reynolds' theatrical menace. "Report," Kane demanded, studying the veteran positions through high-powered binoculars. Reynolds tried to assert authority, but Kane cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Not you," he pointed to Chase. "You? What are we dealing with?" Chase swallowed hard. "They've got every approach covered. Move like a military unit. Their commander..." He hesitated. "What about their commander?" "Marcus Sullivan. They called him the Ghost of Fallujah, specialized in impossible rescues under heavy fire." Kane's expression changed slightly. "The Ghost of Fallujah, you're certain?" "Yes, sir. And he's got nearly 200 veterans with him already. More coming." Kane lowered his binoculars slowly. "You didn't tell me we were facing him," he said to Reynolds. "This changes things." "Why?" Reynolds demanded. "They're just old soldiers." "No." Kane's voice carried decades of military experience. "They're legends, and you've made them angry." At the command center, Mac coordinated with his units as the mercenaries began probing their defenses. Unlike the Outlaws' chaotic attacks, these were disciplined reconnaissance efforts. "They're testing every sector," Torres reported, "looking for weak points." "Let them look," Mac replied. Dylan had already briefed them on the likely approaches. "Tell me about the lumber mill area," Mac asked Dylan. Dylan leaned over the map. "They'll try to use it as a flanking route. It's what I would have suggested." Mac's smile carried echoes of Iraqi operations. "Exactly. So that's where we set our trap." The mercenaries' first serious probe came at noon. a coordinated three-pronged attack meant to split the veteran forces. Kane's men moved with professional precision, but they found themselves facing opponents who'd learned their trade in the world's harshest combat zones. "Contact south," a veteran radio operator announced. "Two vehicles with mounted weapons." "East sector reports movement," another called out. "Infantry with support weapons." "West approach clear," a third voice added. "Two clear." Mac studied the pattern, seeing it with the same tactical eye that had saved countless lives in Fallujah. "They're using the lumber mill route exactly as predicted." He turned to Torres. "Execute Operation Mountain Wind." The trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. As Kane's forces pushed through what they thought was a gap in the veteran lines, they found themselves caught in a perfectly orchestrated kill box, not with lethal force, but with the kind of tactical superiority that makes combat veterans surrender before blood is shed. "Mother of God," one of Kane's sergeants breathed as veterans emerged from concealed positions, their movements showing decades of training. "These aren't retirees playing soldier. These are the real thing." In the veterinary clinic, townspeople watched the operation unfold. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The smooth coordination, the silent communication, the absolute confidence of people who'd faced far worse and prevailed. "Look at Mac," Ellen whispered. "He's not just fighting them, he's teaching them a lesson." Dylan proved his worth repeatedly, anticipating the mercenaries' tactics because he'd helped plan similar ones. Each time Kane's forces tried to implement a strategy, they found the veterans had already countered it. "Impossible," Kane muttered, watching another attack falter against prepared positions. "They know every move before we make it." "Because they've made them all before," Dylan's voice came over their radio frequency. "In places where the stakes were higher and the enemy was stronger. Stand down, Commander. You're fighting ghosts who learned their trade in hell itself." Kane's professional soldiers began to hesitate, their confidence shaken by the realization that they were facing veterans of a different caliber. These weren't the usual local opposition they steamrolled through force and superior firepower. "Colonel Martinez's force 30 minutes out," Torres reported to Mac. The sound of approaching vehicles had become a continuous rumble, like distant thunder growing closer. Reynolds paced the compound frantically. "Attack full force! They can't stop all of us!" But Kane held up his hand. "Listen," he commanded quietly. The rumble was growing louder, and now they could see them. An endless line of vehicles stretching along the mountain highway, all moving with military precision. Leading them was a massive black SUV with colonels. "Of flags! My God!" Kane breathed. "How many?" 300, Dylan's voice came over the radio again. "All combat veterans, all owing their lives to the man whose sanctuary you threatened." Mac's voice followed, calm as ever. "Commander Kane, you've got 10 minutes to surrender your forces. After that, you'll face men and women who've spent decades perfecting the art of war. Your choice." Kane looked through his binoculars one last time, seeing not just the approaching force, but the absolute precision of the veterans already in position. He'd fought many battles, but he knew a losing fight when he saw one. "Stand down," he ordered his men. "We're professionals. We know when." "We're outmatched." Reynolds grabbed his arm. "You can't! We have superior firepower." Kane shook him off with professional disdain. "Firepower means nothing against experience, against brotherhood." He gestured at the veteran positions. "Against ghosts who never forgot how to fight." The morning's engagement had demonstrated something profound, the difference between those who fought for money and those who fought for something deeper, between those who relied on weapons and those who carried their strength, in their unity and experience. As Colonel Martinez's force approached Thunder Creek Valley, Mac stood calmly in his command center, watching Kane's men lay down their weapons. The mercenaries had learned what Reynolds couldn't understand, that real power wasn't found in fear or firepower, but in the unshakable bonds of warriors who'd never forgotten what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. The ground seemed to vibrate as Colonel Ellen Martinez's convoy entered Thunder Creek Valley. 300 vehicles moving in perfect formation. Leading them was Martinez's black SUV, flanked by motorcycles driven by veterans who moved like they'd never left the service. The morning sun glinted off chrome and polished metal, creating an image of unstoppable force. Mac stood outside his command center, watching the arrival with the same calm he'd shown throughout the crisis. Torres stood beside him, coordinating the integration of new forces into their defensive positions. "Just like old times," Torres remarked. "Better odds than Fallujah," Mac replied with a slight smile. Kane and his disarmed men watched in professional awe as the convoy rolled past their position. "Look at that precision," he murmured. "Like a military operation, not a civilian response." "Because that's exactly what it is," Dillon explained, now serving as liaison. "These aren't just veterans, they're men and women who never stopped being soldiers. They just needed the right cause to remind them." The convoy lead vehicles reached Mac's position and stopped with military precision. Colonel Ellen Martinez emerged from her SUV, her bearings still parade ground perfect despite her age. For a moment, she and Mac just looked at each other, decades of shared combat and sacrifice passing between their gazes. "Couldn't just have a quiet retirement, could you?" Martinez asked, a slight smile breaking her official demeanor. "Shouldn't have threatened my sanctuary," Mac replied. "These horses, these veterans, they're family." They embraced briefly, then immediately turned to business. Mac led Martinez into the command center, where updated tactical displays showed the current situation. "Kane's forces have surrendered," Mac reported. "His men are professionals. They recognized a superior force when they saw one." "And Reynolds?" "Cornered, in the compound, increasingly unstable, making calls to Nevada trying to get more support." Kane had been invited to the briefing, his military experience now an asset rather than a threat. "With respect, Colonel," he interjected, "he won't get it. I've already contacted my superiors. Once they learned who we were actually facing," he gestured to Mac, "let's just say no professional outfit has any interest in a war with American veterans." In the veterinary clinic, now serving as a secondary command post, Sarah watched the constant flow of veterans through her doors with amazement. Each group moved with the same disciplined purpose, integrating seamlessly into the operation. "Never seen anything like it," she told Tom Harrison. "The way they work together, like they can read each other's minds. That's what real training looks like," Kane answered, accepting a coffee. "What real brotherhood looks like. We thought we were professionals, but these people," he shook his head, "they're in a different league entirely." At the Raven Riders compound, Reynolds' grip on reality seemed to be slipping by the minute. He paced frantically, ignoring Chase's attempts to reason with him. "You don't understand," Reynolds shouted, his eyes wild. "We can't let them win. We're the Raven Riders. We're feared." "Boss," Chase tried again, "it's over. Kane's men have surrendered. The Mercs are pulling support. We're facing 300 combat veterans led by legends of Iraq. We need to think about survival now. Survival? Reynolds's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. I'll show them survival. I'll show them what happens when you corner a raven. Back at the command center, Dylan's face went pale as he listened to radio transmissions from the compound. Mac, Reynolds has completely lost it. He's rigging explosives, talking about taking half the valley with him. Mac's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Those who'd served with him in Iraq recognized it, the quiet focus that preceded his most daring rescues. Ellen, he turned to Martinez, remember that night outside Fallujah, the ammunition depot? Martinez's eyes lit with understanding. Same approach, same principle, different stakes. Mac turned to Kane. Commander, care to earn some redemption? Kane straightened. Tell me what you need. The next hour saw an operation that demonstrated why Mac had earned his reputation in Iraq. Veterans moved into position with practiced stealth, their movements coordinated by decades of experience. Kane's men, now working alongside them, provided crucial intelligence about the compound's layout. Reynolds has wired the main building, Dylan reported, monitoring radio traffic. He's got enough explosives to level 2 blocks. Keeps ranting about showing everyone what real power looks like. Real power, Mac replied quietly, isn't about destruction. It's about precision, about knowing exactly when and how to act. He turned to Martinez. All units in position? Ready on your mark, just like old times. Mac watched through his tactical display as veterans moved with practiced precision, securing positions, establishing communications, transforming the valley into an impenetrable net. Through his window, he could see the flag that had once flown over his unit in Iraq, now mounted above his barn door. Its stars and stripes now represented something larger than one man's defiance. All units, he keyed his radio, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided men through the worst of Fallujah. Execute Operation Final Thunder. Remember, we're not just stopping destruction. We're preventing a tragedy. Move with precision. Move with purpose. The veterans began their approach to the compound, their movement silent and coordinated. 300 strong, they moved like shadows through the Montana morning, preparing to show Reynolds the true meaning of power. Not the power of explosives and fear, but the power of disciplined strength and unbreakable unity. The compound swam in pre-dawn shadows as Jack Reynolds paced between improvised explosive devices, muttering to himself. Sweat darkened his leather cut despite the mountain chill. The listening devices Dylan had left behind carried his increasingly erratic monologue to the veteran command post. Think they can just walk in here? Think their precious experience means anything against this? He patted a cluster of explosives with disturbing affection. Let them come. Let them all come. In the command center, Mac listened to Reynolds's ranting with the same calm focus he'd shown during the worst firefights. In Iraq, Kane stood beside him, his professional assessment confirming their worst fears. Those are military-grade explosives, he said quietly. The blast radius. Half the town's center would be gone. Not just explosives, Chase added, having finally chosen to help them. He's rigged the fuel tanks too. If those go up... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Mac studied the compound schematic Chase had provided, his mind working through angles and options. Ellen, remember that night in 04, the surrounded hospital? Martinez nodded grimly. Similar setup. Insurgents had it wired to blow. Civilian casualties would have been catastrophic. How'd you get us out of that one? Didn't, Mac replied with a slight smile. Got us in. Dylan's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Mac's voice carried them back decades to another night when the stakes had seemed impossible. Hospital full of wounded, surrounded by insurgents who'd wired the whole building. Everyone said it was suicide to attempt a rescue, but sometimes he traced a road on the current compound map. Sometimes the best way past a trap is straight through it. Torres coordinated with the veteran teams now surrounding the compound, each group moving with practiced silence, taking positions with the precision that came from decades of training. Kane's former men, now working alongside them, provided crucial insights about outlaw protocols and responses. Reynolds isn't thinking straight anymore, Chase reported, monitoring the surveillance. Keeps talking about ravens and ghosts, about showing everyone what real power looks like. Through his binoculars, Mac could see the first hint of dawn. Touching the eastern mountains, the same light that had illuminated countless rescue missions in Iraq now prepared to shine on one final operation. All units report ready, Torres announced. Awaiting your order. Mac keyed his radio, his voice carrying to 300 veterans now positioned around the compound. Remember your training. Remember why we're here. This isn't about revenge. It's about preventing tragedy, about showing there's always another way. Dylan watched in amazement as the veterans acknowledged with practiced efficiency no wasted words, no dramatic promises, just the quiet confidence of people who'd faced worse odds and prevailed. They're really going to do this, he whispered to Kane. They're going to try to save everyone, even Reynolds. Of course they are, Kane replied. That's what makes them different, what makes them better. Inside the compound, Chase's radio crackled with Reynolds's increasingly unhinged orders. Watch every angle. They're out there. The ghosts, the legends, thinking they can just walk in here like they own these mountains. Mac's voice cut through his rant, calm and clear over all frequencies. Jack Reynolds, you've got one last chance. Surrender now. Let your men walk out, and we end this without bloodshed. Reynolds' laugh carried an edge of hysteria. You think I'm afraid of you? You're nothing, just an old man playing soldier. No, son, Mac replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. I'm not playing anything, and neither are the 300 veterans currently surrounding your position. We've all seen real war, real courage, real power. What you're showing now, that's just fear wearing a brave mask. For a moment silence held, then Reynolds' voice returned, darker than before. You want to talk about power? I'll show you power. I'll show everyone what happens when you corner a raven. Mac turned to Martinez, both of them recognizing the tone of a man about to do something desperate. All units, he commanded, execute Operation Final Dawn. Move with precision, move with purpose. The veterans began their approach, each team knowing their exact role. This wasn't a chaotic assault. It was a carefully choreographed operation born of countless similar missions. Kane watched with professional appreciation as the teams moved in perfect coordination. Like a symphony, he murmured. No, Mac corrected quietly, like a rescue mission, because that's what this is. We're not just trying to stop Reynolds, we're trying to save him. Save everyone. The dawn continued its slow creep across Thunder Creek Valley as the operation commenced. Mac stood in his command center, coordinating movements with the same calm precision he'd shown in Iraq. The Marine Corps emblem that had started everything still hung above his barn, its bronze surface now representing something larger than defiance. It represented hope. Hope that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path to redemption, always a way to choose a better ending. The veterans moved through the shadows, their experience guided by strategic genius. They weren't just approaching a dangerous situation. They were moving to prove that real strength wasn't about who could cause the most destruction. It was about who could prevent it. First teams in position, Torres reported. All approaches. Covered? Mac nodded, seeing the parallel patterns between past and present. Just like the hospital, they think the explosives give them control. They don't understand. Explosives don't care who wins. I can get closer, Dylan's voice came through his earpiece. I know the blind spots. Negative, Mac replied firmly. We do this by the book. No heroes today. Sir, Kane interjected, his professional expertise evident. Those demolition charges they're using, they're outlaw standard. I know their weaknesses. He quickly sketched out the explosive layout, pointing out vulnerabilities. Mac studied it with the same focused attention he'd given target maps in Fallujah. Torres, adjust Alpha Team's approach 3 degrees west. He turned to Kane. Commander, take Bravo Team. Show them what you know. The operation continued with precision timing, each team moving in perfect coordination. Through the compound's cameras, Reynolds watched his world shrink as veterans secured position after position. They can't do this, he screamed at his remaining men. We're the Raven Riders, we're feared. Being feared isn't the same as being strong. Mac's voice came through their radios again. Real strength. It's about saving lives, not taking them. About standing for something bigger than yourself. A memory flashed through Dylan's mind. His grandmother saying almost the same words years ago. Now, watching the veterans move with such disciplined purpose, he finally understood what she'd meant. Reynolds, he keyed his radio, trying one last time to reach his former boss. Look at how they move. This isn't about intimidation. This isn't about fear. This is what real power looks like. Through the command center windows, Mac watched his teams continue their careful approach. Each movement was calculated, each position secured with the precision that came from hard-won experience. All teams report final positions, Torres announced. Ready for Phase 2. Mac picked up his radio, his voice carrying to every veteran in position. Remember, we're not here for revenge. We're here to prevent a tragedy, to show there's always another way. He paused, letting the words sink in. Even for those who think they're too far gone. Reynolds's laugh crackled through their radios, but it carried more fear than menace now. You think you can just walk in here? You think your experience means anything against this? The sound of him arming detonators came clearly through the transmission. Son, Mac's voice remained steady. I've walked into worse places for better reasons. The question isn't whether we can stop you. The question is whether you're ready to learn what real strength looks like. The morning sun climbed higher as the operation reached its crucial moment. 300 veterans held their positions, waiting for Mac's signal. They'd faced worse odds in harder places, but the stakes here were just as high. Not just lives, but the chance to show that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path to redemption. Through his binoculars, Mac watched Reynolds pace. Inside his command room, his movements becoming more erratic. The detonators in his hands caught the morning light. Small devices with the power to destroy so much. Just like Fallujah, he murmured to himself. Sometimes the hardest part isn't reaching the target. It's showing them why they should choose to live. Kane moved his team into final position, their movements now matching the veteran precision. "Ready on your mark," he reported. Mac looked one last time at the compound, seeing not just the current crisis, but echoes of every impossible rescue he'd ever attempted. The Marine Corps emblem that had started everything still shone in the morning sun, its meaning now clearer than ever. "All units," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of decades of combat experience. "Execute Operation Final Dawn. Remember your training. Remember why we're here." The veterans began their final approach, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from facing death and choosing life time after time. They weren't just approaching a dangerous situation. They were moving to prove that real power isn't about destruction. It's about having the strength to offer salvation even to those who think they don't deserve it. The veteran entry teams breached the compound's outer perimeter with surgical precision. Each movement was calculated, each step placed with the certainty that came from countless combat operations. Mac's voice guided them through their earpieces, directing the complex operation like a conductor leading an orchestra of shadows. "Team 1, East Corridor secured," Torres reported. "Moving to Phase 2. Reynolds watched through the security, feeds as his outer defenses crumbled, not through violence or brute force, but through a level of tactical expertise he'd never encountered. His men were being systematically isolated and contained, often without even realizing it was happening. "How are they doing this?" he demanded, grabbing Chase by the collar. "How do they know every move before we make it?" Chase watched another security feed go dark as veterans secured another section. "Because they're not fighting us," he said quietly. "They're rescuing us. From you." The detonators trembled in Reynolds' hand as he shoved Chase away. "Rescuing! I'll show them rescue!" He moved toward the main explosive cache, but Chase's voice stopped him. "You know what's really happening here? They're showing us what real professionals look like." Chase pulled his weapon, but instead of aiming at the approaching veterans, he pointed it at Reynolds. "I won't let you kill us all for your pride." Through the compound corridors, Dylan led a specialized team of veterans, his intimate knowledge of the layout proving invaluable. "Next junction has pressure plates," he whispered, "but there's a maintenance bypass through the ventilation system." Kane worked with another team, systematically disarming the explosives they encountered. His outlaw demolitions training now served a different purpose. "These charges are linked in sequence," he reported. "Find the master control unit, and we can isolate the entire network." Mac's voice came through their comms, steady and assured. "Remember Haifa Street, same principle. We're not just clearing rooms, we're clearing paths, options." "Contact front," a veteran called out softly. 3 of Reynolds' men had taken position at a corridor intersection, but something in the veteran approach made them hesitate. "Look at how they move," one outlaw whispered to another. "Like ghosts, like they've done this 1,000 times." Dylan stepped into view, hands raised. "Because they have. Question is, do you want to be the last ones to die for Reynolds' madness, or the first ones to help us stop it?" The outlaws looked at each other, then at their weapons, then at the veterans moving with such deadly grace. Their guns clattered to the floor. In the command center, Mac watched the operation unfold through multiple feeds. Each team moved in perfect coordination, executing a plan that seemed to anticipate every contingency. "Reynolds is moving deeper into the compound," Torres reported. Taking his core group with him, still has the main detonators. He's heading for the fallback position, Chase announced, having fully switched sides. Underground storage area. It's where we kept our reserve ammunition. If he triggers the explosives there... Mac's eyes narrowed as he studied the compound schematic. He's not running, he's setting a trap, trying to draw us in. He keyed his radio. All teams hold position, maintain containment. Let's show him what real patience looks like. Reynolds's voice suddenly burst through their radio network, high and strained. You think you've won. You think your precious experience means anything. I've got enough explosives down here to turn this whole compound into a crater. Son, Mac's reply carried the weight of decades of combat wisdom. If I had $1 for every time someone told me they had the ultimate weapon, I could have bought this valley instead of retiring here. His voice softened slightly. It's not too late to choose a different ending. Different ending. Reynolds's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. I'm writing this ending. Me! The sound of him arming more detonators came through clearly. In the ventilation system above the storage area, Dylan froze. Through a grate, he could see Reynolds and his remaining loyalists setting up their last stand. The detonators gleamed in Reynolds's shaking hand. Sir, he whispered into his radio, I've got a clear line of sight. I could... Negative, Mac cut him off. That's exactly what he wants. Sometimes the hardest part of combat isn't knowing when to act. It's knowing when to wait. He turned to Torres, a familiar glint in his eye. Remember that night in Sadr City, when we used their own defenses against them? Torres grinned. Position 4 variant with a twist. Mac keyed his radio again. All teams prepare for Operation Echo Dawn. We're going to show Reynolds the difference between having power and knowing how to use it. The veterans began moving into new positions, executing a strategy that had been proven in the hardest combat zones on Earth. They weren't just trying to stop a madman. They were trying to save him from himself. Operation Echo Dawn commenced. With absolute silence, no radio chatter, no movement sounds, just the quiet efficiency of veterans who'd learned their craft in the world's deadliest combat zones. Through the compound security feeds, Reynolds watched section after section of... His cameras go dark. They're cutting us off, one of his remaining loyalists whispered. But why aren't they attacking? Reynolds gripped the detonators tighter, his knuckles white. The underground storage area had seemed like the perfect defensive position. Now, it felt like a tomb. They're afraid, he declared, but his voice lacked conviction. They know we can take this whole place down. No, came Mac's voice through their last working radio. We're not afraid, son. We're just patient. Learned that lesson the hard way in the Sunni Triangle. Sometimes victory isn't about who strikes first. It's about who understands the battlefield better. Above them, in the ventilation system, Dylan led a team of veterans through the compound's maintenance tunnels. His years of running outlaw operations had given him intimate knowledge of every hidden passage. Next junction has motion sensors, he whispered, but there's a 3-second delay in the power backup. Kane coordinated with another team, using his demolitions expertise to systematically isolate Reynolds's explosive network. Each section we disconnect reduces his control, he reported. He may not even realize it's happening. In the command center, Mac watched multiple feeds showing the operation's progress. Torres, remember that night outside Tikrit when we turned? Their own bunker system against them? Same principle here. They think being underground makes them secure. Torres nodded. Until they realize they're not in a fortress. "They're in a box," Mac finished. Reynolds's remaining men jumped at every shadow, every distant sound. The veterans' psychological tactics were having their intended effect. These weren't the brutal attacks they'd expected. This was something far more sophisticated. "Movement east corridor!" one outlaw called out, firing at shadows. His bullets hit nothing but concrete. "Hold your fire!" Reynolds commanded, but the strain in his voice was evident. "They're trying to make us waste ammunition." "No," Mac's voice came through the radio again. "We're teaching you the difference between shooting and fighting, between having weapons and knowing how to use them." Through his remaining cameras, Reynolds watched in growing horror as veterans seemed to appear and disappear at will. Every defensive position he'd established was being systematically compromised, not through frontal assault, but through expertise he couldn't counter. "They're ghosts," one of his men whispered, "like the stories about him in Iraq." "They're not ghosts," Dylan's voice came through hidden speakers they hadn't even known existed. "They're professionals, real ones, not men who use fear and violence, but soldiers who understand the truth. Strength is about precision, about patience." Kane's team completed another phase of their operation, isolating another section of explosives. "Master control unit identified," he reported. "Ready for final phase." In the ventilation shaft, Dylan's team reached their designated position. Through the grates, they could see Reynolds's remaining force growing more unstable by the minute. The psychological pressure was having its intended effect. "Keep them contained," Mac ordered. "Let them feel the walls closing in." Sometimes the hardest part of combat isn't the fighting. It's giving your enemy time to realize they've already lost. Reynolds paced frantically, the detonators now slick with his sweat. Every camera feed showed the same thing. Veterans moving with impossible precision, each team exactly where it needed to be, executing a strategy he couldn't comprehend. "Boss," his last lieutenant whispered, "maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Reynolds screamed. "We're still in control. We've still got the explosives. Do you?" Mac's voice carried genuine curiosity. "Look at your monitors again, son. Really look." Reynolds stared at his screens, finally seeing what he'd missed. In the background of every feed, veterans were executing a complex operation he'd never noticed. Each team's movements weren't just coordinated, they were systematically cutting off his options. "Impossible," he breathed. "How? Not impossible," Mac replied calmly, "just experienced. We learned these lessons in places where mistakes meant death, where precision wasn't just about winning, it was about survival." Dylan watched through. The great as understanding began to dawn on Reynolds's face. The outlaw leader was finally realizing that he wasn't facing ordinary opponents. These were masters of their craft, executing a strategy that had been perfected in the harshest combat. "Zones on Earth, final teams in position," Torres reported. "Ready for Phase 3. Max studied the tactical display one last time, seeing not just the current situation, but echoes of countless similar operations. This wasn't just about stopping a threat, it was about showing a better way. "All units," he commanded, "execute. Phase 3. Remember, we're not just containing them, we're showing them what real combat experience looks like." The veterans began their final movements, each team functioning as part of a perfectly coordinated whole. They weren't just approaching a dangerous situation, they were demonstrating that true combat expertise isn't about violence, it's about having the wisdom to turn your enemy's strength against them, and the patience to let them realize they've been outmaneuvered by superior experience. Phase 3 began with a series of precisely timed power fluctuations throughout the compound. Emergency lights flickered, casting unstable shadows that made every corner seem alive with movement. Reynolds' remaining men huddled closer together in the underground storage area, their nerves fraying with each passing moment. "They're in the walls," one whispered, his weapon tracking shadows in the ceiling. "Everywhere," another added, eyes wide. "They're everywhere." Reynolds clutched the detonators with trembling hands, his composed outlaw leader persona completely shattered. "Keep it together. We still have the explosives. We still have control." Control? Mac's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Let me tell you about control, son. Fallujah, 2004. Our unit surrounded by 300 insurgents, outgunned, outmanned. You know what I learned that day?" Despite himself, Reynolds found himself asking, "What?" That control isn't about who has the biggest weapon. It's about who has the clearest mind. Kane's team completed their final preparations, systematically, isolating the last explosive charges. "Primary charges disconnected," he reported quietly, moving to secondary network. In the ventilation system, Dillon guided his team through the final approach. Years of outlaw operations had taught him every weakness in the compound's design. Now that knowledge served a different purpose. "Maintenance junction ahead," he whispered. "From here we can access every corner of the storage area." Mac coordinated the veteran teams as they moved into final position. Each group knew their exact role in what was about to happen. This wasn't just an operation. It was a demonstration of what decades of combat experience looked like in action. Reynolds's radio crackled. "East sector compromised. There..." The transmission cut off abruptly. "Report!" Reynolds screamed into his radio. "Someone report!" "They can't." Mac's voice came through clearly. "They're a bit busy learning what real tactical superiority looks like. Want to know the interesting part? Not one of them has been harmed. We don't need violence to show strength." Through his remaining security feeds, Reynolds watched in growing horror as veterans seemed to materialize from shadows, each team moving with impossible coordination. His men were being systematically isolated and contained, often without even realizing it was happening. "You think this changes anything?" His voice cracked with strain. "I've still got enough explosives to..." "To what?" Mac interrupted gently. "To die. To kill your own men. Look around you, son. Really look. Count your options." Reynolds spun in place, finally seeing what he'd missed. His remaining forces had been reduced to just 3 men, all looking increasingly uncertain. The storage area that had seemed like a fortress now felt like a trap. "You can't win this," he declared, but his voice shook. "Already have," Mac replied calmly. "Look at your detonators." Reynolds's eyes dropped to the devices in his hands. The ready lights that had glowed steady red now pulsed weakly, signaling lost connections. "Impossible," he breathed. "The charges have been systematically isolated for the past hour." Kane's voice came through now. "While you were watching shadows, we were teaching your own explosives to betray you." Dillon's team reached their final position. Through the grates, they could see Reynolds's growing realization that he'd been outmaneuvered on every level. "This is what real combat experience looks like," Mac continued, his voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. "Not brutal force, not fear, but the kind of precision that comes from facing death and choosing life time after time." Reynolds's last lieutenant lowered his weapon. It's over, boss. They've beaten us without firing a shot. That's real power. No! Reynolds raised the detonators. I still have the master control. I can still... The grate above him opened silently. Before he could react, Dylan dropped into the room with cat-like grace, veterans flowing in behind him like smoke. Actually, Dylan said quietly, you don't. Look at the wiring panel. Reynolds's eyes darted to where his explosive controls should have been. The panel was dark, every connection systematically severed during the psychological operation that had kept him distracted. Impossible, he whispered. When did you... The entire time. Mac's voice came from the doorway as he entered the room, his presence carrying the quiet authority that had guided men through the worst battles in Iraq. While you were watching for an attack, we were teaching you about real tactical superiority. The morning sun, filtering through the compound's high windows, caught the silver in Mac's hair, creating a halo effect that made several outlaws cross themselves. They'd heard stories about the Ghost of Fallujah. Now they understood why. Choice is yours now, son, Mac said quietly, moving closer. But choose carefully. Next few seconds determine whether you're remembered as the man who learned from defeat, or the one who let pride destroy everything. Reynolds's hand tightened on the useless detonators as veterans moved with practiced precision to secure the room. He was surrounded by the kind of combat expertise that couldn't be bought or intimidated, the kind that came only from facing real war and emerging stronger. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. In it lay not just Reynolds's fate, but a lesson about the difference between those who used fear as a weapon and those who had transcended fear through experience. Everything hung on what would happen next. Time seemed to freeze in the underground storage area as Reynolds's finger trembled on the detonator trigger, his eyes wild as he looked from face to face. The veterans maintained their positions with practiced discipline, neither advancing nor retreating. Think about it, Mac said softly, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar moments. Really think. All your life you've used fear as a weapon. How's that working out right now? Reynolds's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. You think you understand power? I've built an empire on fear, and we dismantled it without firing a shot, Dylan replied, stepping forward slowly. That's what real power looks like. Kane moved to Dylan's side, his professional assessment clear in his voice. I've been in special operations, worked security contracts, seen every kind of combat. But these veterans, they're showing us what true tactical mastery looks like. Through the compound's remaining security feeds, they could see other Raven riders being processed, not as prisoners, but as people being offered a choice. Veterans guided them with firm but respectful authority, showing through actions what real strength looked like. Your men are safe, Mac continued, every single one. We didn't need violence to prove our point. That's the difference between using fear and understanding duty. Reynolds's eyes darted between the useless detonators and the veterans surrounding him, their calm precision more unnerving than any show of force could have been. These weren't just old soldiers, they were masters of their craft, demonstrating expertise that made his outlaw tactics look amateur. How? He whispered, his voice cracking. How did you do this? By remembering what real combat taught us, Torres answered from his position, that the biggest victories often come without firing a shot. The morning sun filtering through high windows caught Mac's silver hair as he took another step forward. In Iraq, I learned that saving lives is harder than taking them. That real strength isn't about who can cause the most damage. It's about who can prevent it. Dylan touched the cross at his neck, remembering his grandmother's words about different kinds of strength. Now, watching the veterans work, he finally understood what she'd meant. "It's not too late," Dylan said quietly. "They're showing us a better way." Kane nodded in agreement. "Look how they moved, how they thought 10 steps ahead. That's not just experience, that's mastery. The kind of mastery that comes from fighting for something bigger than yourself." Reynolds's hand began to lower, the detonator's weight suddenly seeming unbearable. Around him, he saw not victory or defeat, but something he'd never expected. Understanding. The veterans watched him with the patient eyes of warriors who'd seen it all before. "You could have killed us," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "At any point. Why didn't you?" "Because that's not who we are," Mac replied simply. "We learned the hard way that real victory isn't about destruction, it's about transformation." The detonators slipped from Reynolds's fingers, clattering harmlessly to the floor. As if on cue, veterans moved with practiced efficiency to secure them, their movements precise but not threatening. "What happens now?" Reynolds asked, sounding suddenly very young. Now, Mac's smile carried decades of hard-won wisdom. "You learn what we learned in Iraq, that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought within ourselves. If this story touched your heart and showed you the true meaning of strength, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We've got more powerful stories of redemption, courage, and transformation coming your way that you won't want to miss. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Our next story about unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of combat drops tomorrow. You'll want to be first in line for what we've got planned. Remember, real strength isn't about who can cause the most damage. It's about who can prevent it. See you in our next video.